A nightmare in her own home leaves a young mom fighting for survival.
This is the middle of the day. This is on home security footage, and this is a terrifying event.
26-year-old Keen Winchester is home alone with her 2-year-old son. But suddenly, something terrifying is happening. Right outside their door.
What you see is a man who is trying desperately to get inside of this house. Who is this guy? What does he want from this mom?
Then, Keen hears a loud sound. Her maternal instinct immediately kicks in.
In this situation, the mom needed to act quickly to protect her child and herself.
We don't know what he wants. We don't know if he knows that there's a baby in the house. We don't know what his intentions are. When there's a real threat present, the adrenaline is surging even higher.
Keen grabs her son and bolts.
As a mother, she's thinking, I gotta do everything I possibly can to protect my child from this potential threat.
She hides in a second-floor bathroom, then frantically dials for help.
She's on the phone with 911, with dispatch, when she hears this man actually entering her house. You just don't know in these situations who is with someone else. If there's a car waiting or someone else is maybe on a different part of the house.
Waiting for the police to arrive is unbearable.
She's thinking, does he want my baby? What is he gonna do to me? And is there anything in here that I can use to defend myself and my child?
It takes 10 endless minutes, but when officers do get there, they arrest the frightening stranger on the spot. Police later discover he is under the influence of drugs.
It's dangerous and potentially lethal when you're driven by a need to get high on substances, when you are in physiological withdrawal. Because when you're in that state, you don't care if you hurt someone else. Your judgment is completely thrown off.
Keen releases the video from her doorbell camera to the media.
Honestly, I was shaking. I was just breathing very hard, shaking, begging the dispatcher to please get his cops here, please.
Imagine how agonizing those 10 minutes were.
A worst case scenario is if she wasn't barricaded and if he had access to this child and to this woman, someone with this type of rage, who knows what would have happened. This mom shared this clip and this information on her social media page to help spread the word and to help warn those around her.
The scary ordeal quickly goes viral. She also begs his friends to get him help.
She does show compassion for this person, hoping that he does receive the help that he needs and doesn't target anyone else.
But the trauma this young mom endured is likely to linger.
Keen Winchester was too afraid to stay in her home after this event. She ended up staying with her mother-in-law. She did not feel safe in her own home. When people go through similar type of traumatic events, they really lose their sense of safety, especially when your home has been invaded. You're not able to sleep at night. You don't feel as if you can let your guard down.
And no matter where it happens, when glass shatters, it's almost always the beginning of something bad. You're looking at a brazen burglary caught on camera.
This happened just before 10 o'clock Sunday night.
It is so many people, we can hardly even count them, running in and out of the store.
We're looking at surveillance footage from inside a local shoe store called Ballad Kit. Right after they closed for the night.
All of a sudden, you see the glass shatter and all hell breaks loose.
It's a wild late-night smash-and-grab break-in.
10, 20, maybe 30 people running in and out of the store.
They're just grabbing anything in sight and making off with it.
But they don't realize that the owner, Keith Cannon, can see their every move. His phone is connected to the store's security cameras.
And when I looked at my phone, I just seen people just ambushing through there, just taking all the merchandise, all of that. I watched it live.
It is a full-on spectacle in this shoe store right now. It's madness.
Keith keeps his high-ticket items in the back behind a locked steel door. But these thieves are prepared.
Somehow they knew to go to the back bathroom, kick a hole through the drywall, climb through the piping to get to the other side of that door. It just had to be somebody that, like, a customer maybe, KCID, see how to get through what.
And whoever has tipped the criminals off, they have very specific information.
For the kids in the neighborhood, we had a lounge area where we had refreshments, drinks, snacks, and they come in there and play the PS5. They don't have to necessarily buy nothing. We just wanted to have a friendly environment. We had that drilled to the wall. They snatched it right off the wall.
But the last move this brazen gang makes is by far the hardest blow.
Now, if you look right here, you can see the burglars removing a box. This box is not merchandise from the store.
They stole toys that were being collected for a local toy drive. I understand wanting the shoes, but what is the point of stealing those toys for any reason besides just being pure evil?
The thing that hurt me the most with the toy drive is they wasn't just stealing from me. You know, they were stealing from kids that actually needed the toys and was looking forward to having those toys for the holidays.
With their bags stuffed with toys, the PS5, and hundreds of pairs of shoes, the bold thieves run off. In just 4 minutes, they have left this community-minded store in shambles. And the next day, the shocking footage is all over the news.
On camera, $100,000 worth of Nike shoes stolen just like that.
In this business, the latest victim of smash and grab.
For Keith, it's not just the loss of merchandise. This crime has a devastating ripple effect.
It affected my employees greatly because they all had kids they had to feed, and it was right before the holidays. So I wasn't able to stay open for them to make money.
Making it even harder, it isn't the first time this has happened.
Unfortunately, this was probably the third or fourth time we got robbed within 6 months, because the store haven't even been open a full year yet.
And for someone as giving as Keith, it's a deeply personal blow.
It breaks my heart because I don't only do this for money, I do this for the love. I really love shoes, I really love networking with people. I really like just showing people that they can always beat the odds, because I don't have a college degree. I don't have a degree in business. It's something I just had a passion in, and I just stepped out on faith and tried it. I did a program where kids in the neighborhood, they could bring a report card in, they can bring in a book report they did, anything positive that they did, they can come in and get a free pair of shoes.
This video is so upsetting to watch, not only because you feel for the store owners, but especially that they're stealing from a store that really is trying to do a lot of good in their community.
But the community has Keith's back too.
The toys that they stole, the community reached out and donated a lot of money to the GoFundMe, where we were able to get these kids Christmas toys right before the holidays.
Unfortunately, the case remains unsolved, and there have been no arrests. But wherever they are, Keith would love to have a word with these toy-stealing criminals.
I wouldn't even want to send them to jail, honestly. I want to see what's going in their brain. For you to break into a store, risk your life, risk your freedom for a little bit of nothing. Come on.
Another case of callous theft also elicits outrage because it involves an innocent grandmother. This one begins when a doorbell camera catches a courier picking up a package.
Hello? Hi. I'm supposed to ask you the invoice number? Okay, how do you want?
But this isn't what it looks like.
A Long Island grandmother has outsmarted some would-be thieves.
I really wasn't scared because I never thought it would get that far, you know?
For Jean Ebert, it begins as a routine day until she picks up the phone.
And this guy is on here crying, "Oh, Grandma, I'm in trouble. I've been in a car accident."
The man who claims he's her grandson says he's been arrested and needs $8,000 for bail. But there's one problem with his story.
I don't have a grandson old enough to drive. So I knew it was a scammer right from the beginning. So I said to him, listen, don't tell your mother. She's going to be mad. Let me handle this. You know, I played along.
What the scammer doesn't know is that Jean is a retired 911 phone operator.
I worked for 911 for a long time. I was a police dispatcher, call taker dispatcher. 911 people are kind of, you need certain skills to do it. You know, you're the calm in the chaos. You know, you have to stay calm.
And she knows a thing or two about scams.
I know the scammers are out there. I mean, I heard from people all over the world whose parents have fallen for this scam.
So when the man tells her he's sending an associate to pick up the money, she immediately knows what to do.
She gets the police involved.
They said when he comes to the door, hand him the envelope and then step away.
It's a trap. The police rush over, and when the scammer shows up, they are already hiding inside Jean's house.
All she can do is wait and see if he takes the bait.
So then I started to think, I hope nothing happens. I hope the bad guy doesn't have a gun.
Hello?
Hi. I'm supposed to ask you the invoice number?
Jean hands over the envelope as instructed, except it isn't filled with cash.
The envelope was full of paper towels folded up.
Okay, how do you want?
Okay. Then I backed away and they did their thing.
The whole time, the man who called claiming to be Jean's grandson is on hold.
I still had the scammer on the phone, so. Yeah, I'm here. Hey, guess what? And I guess he heard the commotion. Hi. Anybody want to talk to the guy on the phone? And wasn't in contact with his guy anymore, so he hung up quick. I was just glad it was over. It was a little interesting.
Jean's bravery is an instant news hit.
A good turn to that quick-thinking grandmother who tricked a suspected scam artist.
Police say the suspect was arrested and charged with attempted grand larceny in the 3rd degree.
A story like this is universal no matter where you live or anything like that, because we all have grandparents that we're worried about, or we all have somebody elderly in our life that we don't want to be scammed. So it's kind of a good lesson learned, and also to let those scammers know, we're on to you.
For Jean, it's all a bit overwhelming.
That night I had the local news here. The people, they came with their little trucks and they did like little videos with me, and I was just shocked at how fast something can go viral. And I knew he was a real scammer. I just knew he wasn't gonna scam me. My son was home and he's like, "Ma, it's on YouTube. You have this many hits."
And the lesson here? Don't mess with grandmas who can beat you at your own game.
Born grandma 1, bad guy 0. Anybody want to talk to the guy on the phone?
In Indiana, It's a different kind of unlikely hero who throws criminals off their game.
These alleged thieves picked a home to invade.
People are disturbed by the video.
A violent invasion, thwarted by something very unexpected. A group of armed men invade a home and find a very unlikely deterrent.
I don't think that any 5-year-old should probably try to be a hero, but in this particular situation, it seemed to work.
So we're looking at footage from inside the home of Tamika Reed. She's currently ironing some clothes while her 5-year-old son plays with his toys nearby.
And out of nowhere, 4 guys kick in the door, rush towards her.
The panicked mom screams and begs the intruders not to shoot.
1 second, Tamika's ironing clothes. The next minute, she's fighting for her life.
She's terrified they will hurt her son, but she never expects what happens next.
5-year-old David sees what's going on, and he decides he's going to act.
Look at the bottom of the screen. This little boy is about to defend his home.
Starts punching and hitting them, which is scary. They're 3, 4, 5 times this 5-year-old's size.
As David bravely battles the dangerous men, Tamika makes a calculated move.
It almost seems like she actively works her way out of that living room area with the suspects in hopes of drawing them towards her and away from David.
I have to imagine that Tamika's thinking, I just want to keep me and my son alive.
Her plan works. The men follow her into the next room, leaving David alone. But this brave kid isn't done yet.
At that moment, you can see David looking around, trying to find his weapon of choice, and he chooses his toy cars.
I think they're so caught off guard by this 5-year-old not being terrified at all.
That's not enough. David realizes that the toy didn't do the job, so he physically attacks the suspect, punching him multiple times. David's right in the middle of everything. He's literally hanging on the arm of one of the suspects, who, by the way, is in possession of a gun. But David has no fear. He's there to protect his mom.
We look at this 5-year-old and we can say he's a hero, but it's also really scary. These guys have broken in the middle of the day. They are dangerous.
When the suspects come in, clearly they have bad intentions, but as soon as they're engaged by David, they realize that whatever it isn't worth what they're getting into right now, and they decide to flee the area.
The men who came in look pretty young, and maybe that's the reason he didn't get hurt, because they saw themselves in that 5-year-old kid.
Whatever the reason may be, David's a hero.
And David's heroics get viral attention.
The video was posted today by police to try to get more leads in the case, and it went viral. People are disturbed by the video, and they also are quick to notice the bravery of a little boy trying to fight back.
Tamika also speaks to the media about the traumatizing ordeal.
My thing was, I need to get him out the house before they do something to my son.
But the media praises David, comparing him to his favorite superhero.
A lot of people are saying you're just like Batman, you're a superhero.
Although police have yet to identify the suspects, if they are caught, they'll face stiff charges.
Armed robbery, felony assault with a dangerous weapon. They're gonna have some issues for sure, and I hope they are caught.
And as terrifying as this would be for any parent, Tamika definitely had the right instincts.
I think anytime you're dealing with a home invasion, the best thing to do is try to run if you can, and if you can't, just try to cooperate. Humanize yourself as much as you can. Say your name, say your child's name. The more they think that you are a real person with a real life, the less likely they are to take your life.
And luckily, this house had its very own defender.
I definitely think there's a future in law enforcement for David. You can clearly tell he's a person of great character, and I can't wait to see what he accomplishes.
Go. You won't believe what you're about to see.
This is happening right in people's driveways.
This crime happens in a matter of 2 minutes.
One of the robbers pulls a gun and points it at him.
This is a small city just outside San Francisco, the middle of the day, and there are 2 men seen approaching this vehicle.
They look like they're here to repair the car.
And then you start hearing these really loud power tools.
These guys are thieves, and they want something very specific.
A catalytic converter is something that essentially changes pollutants to emissions.
They can be a hot ticket item because of the metals that exist inside of them.
Platinum, palladium, rhodium.
And what these offenders will do, they'll cut them off, they'll sell them to a scrapyard.
And they go for a lot of money, and that's why catalytic converters are stolen so much.
This is happening right in broad daylight, so they really don't care.
It's really simple to steal catalytic converters, unfortunately. You just need regular power tools that any person probably has in their garage.
When the homeowner, Michelle Morris Richardson, releases her security footage, the story spreads all over the news.
2 bold crooks stealing a catalytic converter from a Stockton family's car.
They weren't even trying to hide their faces. They weren't wearing gloves. They looked right into the Ring camera. They were just kind of like, yeah, we're here, we're gonna take it.
And this isn't just isolated to certain cities, this is everywhere.
Across the country, catalytic converter theft is on the rise, increasing a whopping 1,200% between 2019 and 2022. In Connecticut, thieves literally roll a woman's car out of her driveway so they have better access.
This poor woman's car is left in the middle of the street. This crime happens in a matter of 2 minutes. The local news in this case interviews the car's owner, and she had a lot to say.
I know my car, since it's a Honda, is a target, so I'm worried about that too. Like, what if I fix it and they just come back and take it again?
The problem is so bad that some car owners are fighting back, like this man in Florida.
This guy has already had his catalytic converter stolen once. He comes running down the stairs. One of the robbers pulls a gun and points it at him. He just starts pelting rocks at the guys. He knew how much money he had already spent replacing one catalytic converter. If I ended up having to pay thousands out of pocket, I might resort to throwing rocks too.
Catalytic theft is so prevalent that many car owners are being forced to take preemptive action.
If you're having to park on the street, you can really prevent this theft by having a piece of metal that's welded and protects the catalytic converter.
But as long as it remains lucrative, these bold driveway thefts are likely to continue.
Sadly, nowhere is safe for catalytic converters.
And being targeted at home, the place where you are supposed to feel safe and secure, is something no one wants to experience. This is a bizarre attack.
Like a scene out of a horror movie.
I can't imagine someone doing this to my home.
It's a horrifying scene that unfolds just before 5 p.m. in Pasadena.
This is an ordinary day on a quiet street.
All of a sudden, we see a woman walking up to a door. There's something strange about her. It looks like she's wielding an axe. Surveillance video catches her as she's breaking these windows open.
From inside, there's a piercing scream. It's the homeowner's mother.
She's by herself inside the house when all of a sudden, something of this magnitude happens.
Her scream startles the axe-wielding woman. And there's something else.
Horrifyingly, we discover that right next to one of those windows is a newborn baby in a bassinet.
The grandmother is babysitting her 6-week-old grandchild.
Just in time, she gets to the bassinet, pulls the baby out before the woman breaks the window. Shards of glass fall into the bassinet.
This is a grandmother who has excellent instincts.
Questions? Questions, anyone?
After some disturbing muttering, the axe-wielding woman makes an ominous threat.
I'll be back! Get out!
I can't imagine someone doing this to my home
I'll be back!
and then shouting out that they may be back again. It's really hard to process.
She doesn't leave. She pauses, then turns back towards the house.
What's absurd is that the homeowners don't even know who this woman is.
Off camera, she continues to wreak havoc.
You start to wonder, does this person have paranoid delusions? Are what they're thinking based in reality?
Then, just as suddenly as it began, it's over. The next day, after the frightened homeowners release their surveillance video, it dominates the news.
A horrifying experience for a family in Pasadena. A woman
with a pickaxe came banging on their front door.
Police say the estimated damages total about $20,000.
The homeowner describes the petrifying incident from his mother-in-law's perspective.
She immediately, first instinct, ran and grabbed the baby. And then as she looked up, she sees this crazy lady with a massive pickaxe about to swing it again.
Police later discover the woman, 65-year-old Beverly Baker, casually walking the neighborhood with the axe slung over her shoulder.
Most people, when they do something of this nature, they understand the repercussions, they run, they flee. It's the opposite in this case. She likely is not rooted in reality.
Assuming a mental illness is involved, police proceed with caution.
Law enforcement are trained to de-escalate situations when the person is violent or aggressive due to a mental health condition.
After a 30-minute standoff, she's taken into custody and charged with felony vandalism. There's no obvious motive, and it seems to be a random attack. But it shakes these homeowners to the core.
The best part of this is that no one was hurt. The baby wasn't injured, the grandmother wasn't injured, and that's really, all you can ask for in a terrible situation like this.
Sometimes, though, criminals are so focused on their targets, it's impossible to get away.
To an alarming abduction, all of it caught on camera.
This man took her.
She's being dragged out the front door by someone who is armed and dangerous.
It's a shocking abduction in the middle of the day.
Don't let this person simply drive away.
It begins as a typical workday for the young clerk in this store.
You think about a workplace, it's sort of a haven of sorts, not a place where you would be attacked.
But this young woman is on edge because someone has been watching her every move.
This person has been, over the last several weeks, has been following her,
stalking her, following her around in the car, trying to find out where she lives.
And when she sees him outside of her workplace, she is terrified.
The suspect was armed with a hammer.
The clerk immediately hits the store's silent alarm.
When he walked through the door that day, she knew that there was trouble, and that's why the silent alarm was triggered.
The security camera does not capture everything, but what it does show is difficult to watch. The man violently forces the woman out of the store.
It's happening in broad daylight. This attack could have happened to any one of us. I feel for this woman.
It is very disturbing to see a woman being drugged out of our store.
Equally disturbing, someone walks right by, as if the kidnapping isn't even happening.
A postal worker who walks into the store and almost trips or steps over top of her and then places the mail on the counter and walks out.
For whatever reason, it appears that he is completely ignoring what is going on.
He could have helped her, but he just kind of passes over her and goes about his business.
The woman puts up a desperate fight, but as detectives later explain at a press conference, her stalker was determined.
He was forcing her in the car, using his body weight, striking her, holding her hands down, pushing her in. He was seen wielding a hammer in his right hand, making striking motions to her lower part of her body.
If anyone is going to be forced into the car, it is not going to be good. They may say they're not going to kill you, but they will kill you.
By the time police arrive about 20 minutes later, the victim is gone.
Police learn that the abducted woman is 28 years old. And whoever her hammer-wielding stalker is, their best lead to finding him is the car he forced her into.
Police move quickly. They release a BOLA, which is a be on the lookout announcement for this particular vehicle.
That helps police identify the suspect almost immediately. 29-year-old Jose Eduardo Gasiola Caro. Police warn that Caro is considered armed and dangerous. 2 hours after the abduction, he takes the terrified woman to a cemetery, where she bravely manages to escape. Someone spots her and gets her to a local hospital.
According to reports, she may have been hit several times, not just as she was being dragged into the vehicle, but also once she was inside of the car with him.
As police launch a manhunt for Caro, they reveal that he held the victim hostage inside the car with a knife to her throat. At times, he threatened to kill her.
This was an intense 2 hours. She was threatened and things were done to her.
So where is this violent stalker now? And how can this woman be certain she is safe? Hours after a kidnapped woman bravely escapes from a man who has stalked and terrorized her, police track down her attacker.
Tonight, the manhunt and the takedown police just made.
When the security footage hits the news, it catches everyone's attention.
A dramatic end to an alarming abduction, all of it caught on camera.
As this news conference is underway, the hammer-wielding kidnapper was tasered and then taken into custody.
Jose Eduardo Gasiola Caro is charged with a host of felonies, including attempted premeditated murder, kidnapping to commit rape, assault with a deadly weapon, and fleeing police.
At this point, the suspect has been convicted and is now sentenced and is serving 22 years behind bars.
The case is a frightening reminder to all women to never take stalking lightly.
This gentleman made mention that he knew where some of her family members lived and made some threats against those family members.
Stalkers tend to have this idea that the object of their obsession is an object. It's a thing for them to use and abuse. That's scary because this woman could have lost her life.
It's also scary when crooks are hell-bent on getting what they want, no matter what.
Out of nowhere, boom.
This involves cars used for violence.
Inside, it's a complete disaster.
It's used as this weapon through the front of the store.
It's a quiet night outside of the Valero gas station in Texas. The surveillance video picks up a white vehicle, and then out of nowhere,
They blast right through the front of the store. Back out and go at it again.
Luckily, there are not a lot of people in the store.
This was in the early morning hours. And thankfully, the two people who were inside, they managed to escape very, very quickly.
The driver leaps out to head into the mangled building.
And then just starts ransacking the gas station store.
The only thing he takes, the store's one cash register.
Look, if you want to rob a store, it's terrible, but can you just take it without completely destroying someone's property? All of this damage for one cash register. It just can't be worth it.
Then, as quickly as he appeared, he flees. But there is one important clue.
So what's unique about this vehicle is that it was allegedly stolen from the local school district.
It was found later down the road. He had just ditched it. And the fact that he was even able to steal this vehicle in the first place is kind of amazing.
Police are unable to locate the driver. The next day, local news broadcasts the damage.
If you take a look behind me, you can see right now workers are trying to board up the front doors of this Valero gas station.
I heard it through the grapevine.
Okay.
That someone had destroyed my store. And I say my store because it's the neighborhood store.
This is the local store that all of the residents use in this small town, and there was over $100,000 in damages done to it.
2 days later, Chadwick Allen McMillan is caught in a stolen vehicle trying to burglarize a different store. After a lengthy police chase, he is arrested.
At this hour, investigators confirm they believe McMillan is behind the Valero smash and grab from Monday morning and the high-speed police chase with the stolen vehicle yesterday.
And it turns out McMillan is an ex-con with a lengthy rap sheet who was released from prison just a few months earlier.
Here we go again. This is another video, this time out of Minneapolis, Minnesota. Instead of driving into the store, they're backing in.
Completely shattering it.
Luckily, once again, no one was harmed in this incident. The store was closed.
Two guys get out, and all they start grabbing are tobacco and CBD products. All of this damage for just some tobacco and CBD. It seems so juvenile.
This seems like a very high risk, very low reward crime.
Loot in hand, the two thieves return to the car and make their escape. The story is big news in Minneapolis.
Luckily, no one got hurt. That's obviously my first concern. When I saw that, I just immediately thought, must be dumb kids.
So far, there have been no arrests.
You have to wonder how desperate people are to be causing all of this damage for such a low reward. This isn't a giant heist of the Mona Lisa. It's products that are worth a few $100.
And it's a reminder to always be aware of your surroundings.
If you're in a store and you see a car backing up, get out of the way.
The file opens at 2:17 a.m., a time stamped in red ink on a yellowed evidence log. The kind of hour when phones don't ring unless something has gone terribly wrong. The kind of hour that turns ordinary streets into stages for irreversible acts. And on a quiet stretch of Northern California asphalt in the spring of 1994, something happened that still refuses to stay buried. Something that would fracture a community and then sit in silence for decades, waiting, watching, becoming a cold case that never quite went cold. The patrol car was the first to arrive, its headlights cutting through a thin coastal fog, illuminating a scene that felt staged, almost deliberate, as if whoever had done this wanted it to be found exactly like this. A young woman lying just beyond the shoulder of the road, shoes missing, jacket folded neatly beside her, no skid marks, no broken glass, no sign of a struggle that made sense, only the unsettling stillness of a life abruptly paused, and an officer standing there too long before reaching for his radio. Because some scenes demand a moment of disbelief before procedure can take over. Her name would be spoken carefully at the morning briefing, syllable by syllable, as if saying it too quickly might erase her. 23 years old, recently moved to California, a part-time waitress with plans that existed only in notebooks and late-night phone calls home. Someone who had been seen laughing hours earlier, someone who had no reason to end up alone on a dark road. And yet here she was, the beginning of a mystery that would ripple outward, touching every corner of the town, every family who locked their doors a little earlier that night. The first reports were thin, almost apologetic, a body found, no immediate suspects, police asking for information, and the community responded the way communities always do in the early hours of shock, with candlelight vigils and whispered theories, with strangers introducing themselves to one another because fear has a way of breaking down social walls, and beneath it all, the unspoken question that no one wanted to ask out loud. If it happened to her, could it happen to anyone? Investigators worked fast, or at least it felt fast at the time, canvassing nearby homes, knocking on doors while the sun was still rising, asking if anyone had heard a scream, a car door, footsteps, anything that cut through the ordinary night sounds, but memories were vague, timelines blurred, and the fog that had rolled in hours earlier seemed to have erased more than just visibility. It had swallowed answers whole, leaving behind only fragments that refused to connect. The crime scene yielded what crime scenes often do in the mid-90s, a mix of promise and frustration, fibers that could have come from anywhere, footprints distorted by damp soil, biological traces carefully collected and sealed in evidence bags that no one realized would sit untouched for years, because back then, DNA was still spoken of with cautious optimism, a powerful tool, yes, but not the instant truth machine it would later become, and so those samples were logged, cataloged, and quietly pushed to the back of the room as detectives chased leads that felt more immediate. There was the ex-boyfriend angle, examined and dismissed, his alibi thin but unbroken, his grief messy and public, not the controlled silence of a man hiding something. Then the coworker who had offered her a ride weeks earlier, harmless on paper, unsettling in interviews, but nothing solid enough to hold on to. And then the stranger theories, the passing truck, the wrong place at the wrong time, the faceless predator who drifts through towns like this and leaves nothing behind but fear. As days turned into weeks, the headlines shifted, from bold black type to smaller columns, from front-page urgency to background noise, and that's how cold cases are born, not in a single moment of failure, but in a slow, almost polite withdrawal of attention, as resources are reassigned, as new crimes demand new answers, and the old ones are left to age quietly in filing cabinets, their edges softening with time. For the family, time moved differently, every unanswered phone call a new wound, every rumor a fresh betrayal. They returned to the site where she was found, stood where the patrol car once idled, and tried to imagine the last moments of a daughter who had promised to call the next day. And the absence of answers became its own kind of violence, an invisible force that pressed down year after year. Inside the police department, the case never officially closed. It simply went dormant, a status that sounds benign until you understand what it really means, that the trail has gone cold, that the suspects have dissolved into the background of ordinary life, that the evidence waits patiently for a future it cannot predict, and every so often, usually late at night, a detective would pull the file, flip through the photographs, reread the notes, and feel that familiar frustration rise again. The sense that something crucial had been missed in the first frantic days. The town changed, as towns do. New businesses replaced old storefronts. Kids who had attended the vigil grew up and moved away. But the story lingered, told in lowered voices, referenced whenever someone mentioned that stretch of road. A cautionary tale wrapped in uncertainty. And the phrase, California 1994 cold case, became shorthand for something darker. A reminder that not all crimes announce their endings. Years later, when technology leaped forward and databases expanded, someone would remember the evidence bags sealed decades earlier, would wonder what secrets they still held. But in the mid-90s, standing at the edge of that road with the fog lifting and the day beginning like any other, no one could have known how long this silence would last, or how deeply it would carve itself into the collective memory. Because at that moment, all that existed was a body, a question without an answer, and the uneasy feeling that the truth was still out there, waiting just beyond reach, patient as time itself. By the time the first anniversary arrived, the case had already begun to feel older than its single year, like something left behind by a different era, its edges dulled by repetition and fatigue, and yet inside the department the file remained thick, swollen with interviews, tips, and false starts, each one a promise that collapsed under scrutiny, each one reminding detectives that a cold case is not defined by a lack of effort, but by the cruel mismatch between questions and answers. The tips came in waves, triggered by memory, guilt, boredom, or the simple human need to be heard. A neighbor recalling a car that didn't belong. A bartender insisting she saw the victim arguing with someone she'd never seen before. A late-night caller whispering a name and hanging up before anyone could ask why. And every tip had to be treated like it mattered, because sometimes the smallest detail is the one that cracks everything open. Except this time, it never did. Detectives mapped the final hours again and again, reconstructing her movements with the precision of a watchmaker, placing pins on corkboards, drawing lines between locations that now looked deceptively close. The restaurant where she'd finished her shift, the payphone where she'd called a friend, the intersection where she'd last been seen walking alone, and somewhere in those ordinary spaces, the moment when her night diverged from everyone else's. Witnesses described the area as quiet, too quiet, the kind of quiet that amplifies footsteps and makes every passing engine feel intrusive, and yet no one remembered hearing a scream, no sudden shout, no unmistakable sound of violence, a detail that gnawed at investigators, because silence can mean consent or surprise, or a threat so immediate that resistance never had a chance to form. The autopsy report added weight without clarity, confirming what everyone already knew but desperately wanted to understand, that she had been killed somewhere else and moved, that the placement of her body was deliberate, almost careful, and that whoever was responsible had taken steps to minimize evidence, a level of control that suggested planning rather than impulse, patience rather than panic. There were debates inside the task force, quiet arguments held behind closed doors, about whether this was the work of someone local or someone passing through, a resident who knew the roads and the rhythms of the town, or a transient figure who vanished as quickly as he appeared. And both theories had merit, both could explain the absence of witnesses, the lack of obvious motive, the hollow space where a suspect should have been. The community felt the strain in subtle ways. Extra locks installed, routines altered, a town learning to live with a question mark, and every time another young woman went missing somewhere else in the state, the fear surged back. Because unresolved cases have a way of reaching far beyond their original borders, turning distant headlines into personal threats. Years passed, and the case slipped into a different phase, no longer the subject of daily briefings but never fully forgotten. Its evidence boxed and labeled, stored in climate-controlled rooms that smelled faintly of dust and disinfectant, where time seemed to stand still. And among those boxes were the samples collected that night, biological traces whose potential was still limited by the technology of the era. Then, quietly, without fanfare, everything changed, not because of a confession or a dramatic arrest, but because of a laboratory upgrade, a new database, a technician who understood that what once seemed inconclusive might now speak more clearly, and so the samples were pulled, re-examined, fed into machines that didn't exist in 1994, machines that could read stories written in cells. The first results were tentative, partial profiles that hinted at a presence but refused to resolve into certainty, enough to raise hope, not enough to sustain it, and for a moment it felt like the past was teasing the present, offering just enough to keep the file open a little longer. Detectives who had inherited the case approached it with fresh eyes, unburdened by the assumptions of the original investigation, questioning why certain leads were dismissed, why some witnesses were never re-interviewed, why the timeline was treated as fixed when memory itself is fluid. And in those questions lay both progress and frustration, because reopening old wounds rarely brings clean answers. They tracked down former suspects, now older, some settled into quiet lives, others hardened by years of being looked at sideways, and the interviews carried a different weight this time, shaped by decades of distance, by the knowledge that people change but lies often don't, and still, nothing broke, no sudden confession, no slip that could be seized upon. The media circled back, drawn by the phrase that never truly loses its power, cold case. And with that attention came renewed pressure, cameras outside the station, headlines that promised developments without delivering conclusions, and families who had learned to brace themselves against disappointment now found themselves cautiously hopeful again. But progress is rarely linear, and just as momentum seemed to build, the trail stalled once more, the partial DNA profile failing to match anyone in existing databases, a reminder that technology, for all its promise, is only as useful as the information it has to work with, and that many people leave no trace behind, at least not one that can be easily found. Inside the department, the case occupied a strange space, both active and dormant, discussed in meetings but rarely advanced. Its very age becoming an obstacle, witnesses dying, memories fading, physical locations altered beyond recognition. And yet there was an unshakable sense that the answer existed, that it had always existed, locked inside evidence waiting for the right moment. For the family, hope became a careful thing, something handled gently, because every phone call from law enforcement carried the possibility of closure or fresh pain, and over time, they learned to live with uncertainty as a constant companion, an unwelcome but familiar presence. The town itself seemed to remember, even when individuals moved on, the story resurfacing in anniversaries, in late-night conversations, in the way people spoke about that stretch of road as if it were marked, and the unresolved nature of the crime gave it a mythic quality, a narrative that resisted resolution. By the late 2000s, the case had accumulated layers, each era leaving its imprint, handwritten notes alongside digital files, analog photographs scanned and refiled, and somewhere in that accumulation was the sense that the truth had been approached from every angle except the one that mattered. And so the cold case persisted, not as a static failure, but as a living thing, evolving with each technological advance, each new detective, each renewed effort. A reminder that some stories refuse to end quietly, that some questions linger not because they are unanswerable, but because the moment to answer them has not yet arrived. And as the years stretched on, the silence surrounding that night in 1994 grew heavier, charged with the possibility that when it finally broke, it would do so with consequences no one could fully anticipate. By the time the case crossed its 20th year, it no longer belonged to the past alone. It existed in a strange overlap of decades, where the night of the crime felt both distant and immediate, frozen in photographs while the world around it raced forward. And the detectives now assigned to it spoke about 1994 the way historians talk about a vanished civilization, a time before smartphones, before constant surveillance, before every movement left a digital shadow. What haunted them most was not what they knew, but what they couldn't place, a missing hour that refused to be accounted for. A gap between her last confirmed sighting and the moment her body appeared on that roadside, and in that gap lived every possibility, every version of the story that might explain how a routine walk home turned into a fatal detour. They returned to the geography of the crime, standing where witnesses once stood, tracing the same routes under different skies, because places remember even when people forget, and sometimes a road reveals its secrets only after years of being overlooked, a blind curve, a pull-off hidden from view, a spot where headlights would briefly disappear before re-emerging, details that felt insignificant until they were reconsidered through the lens of intent. There was a theory that gained quiet traction, never officially endorsed, never fully dismissed, the idea that she knew her killer, not well, not intimately, but enough to let her guard down, enough to step into a car without a fight, because the absence of chaos suggested compliance, or at least the illusion of safety, and that illusion is often the most dangerous thing of all. Old interviews were replayed, voices crackling on tape, pauses scrutinized, the cadence of answers analyzed by people who weren't there the first time, people who had learned to hear what earlier investigators might have missed, the hesitation before a denial, the detail offered too quickly, the memory that felt rehearsed rather than recalled. One name resurfaced more often than others, not because the evidence pointed cleanly in that direction, but because it never fully pointed away, a peripheral figure from the original timeline, someone who lived nearby, someone whose movements that night were inconveniently vague, someone who had aged into respectability, a job, a family, a life that looked nothing like the silhouette of a suspect, and that contrast made the question sharper, not duller. When detectives knocked on his door again, decades later, the shock registered immediately, the past arriving unannounced on a quiet afternoon, and the interview that followed was polite, almost cordial, two sides circling each other with practiced restraint. But beneath the surface, something had shifted, because time changes the stakes, and what once felt survivable can become unbearable when the possibility of exposure suddenly feels real. Still, nothing actionable emerged, no confession, no evidence strong enough to justify an arrest, just the lingering sense that proximity alone is not proof, and that suspicion, no matter how persistent, is not a substitute for certainty. Elsewhere, a different path was opening, driven not by interviews or intuition, but by data, as national DNA databases expanded and protocols evolved, allowing profiles once considered incomplete to be uploaded, compared, and cross-referenced against a growing population of offenders and arrestees. And this was where the case found a second pulse, faint but unmistakable. The profile derived from those long-stored samples was quietly entered, not with optimism, but with resolve, because experience had taught everyone involved to expect nothing, to treat hope as a liability. And then, months later, a notification appeared, not a match, not yet, but a familial hit, a partial overlap that suggested shared genetic markers with someone already in the system. It wasn't the kind of breakthrough that makes headlines, it was subtle, technical, the sort of development that could easily be misunderstood, but to investigators it was seismic because it transformed the question from who could have done this to who in this genetic orbit could have done this, narrowing a universe of strangers into a finite, traceable web of relationships. The work that followed was meticulous and quiet, building family trees from public records, tracing lines through marriages, births, relocations, watching patterns emerge where randomness once reigned, and as the branches grew, certain names began to recur in ways that felt less coincidental and more inevitable. One branch led back to California in the early 90s, to a man whose movements intersected with the victim's world in fleeting but undeniable ways. Not enough to draw attention at the time, not enough to register as suspicious until decades later, when those intersections were re-examined with the benefit of hindsight and data. But even here, the case resisted closure because the law moves slower than science, and suspicion, even genetically informed suspicion, must still be proven in court, and the evidence, though compelling, was still circumstantial, still vulnerable to doubt, still one step short of the final threshold. As word of renewed activity leaked, the town reacted the way it always had, with a mixture of guarded interest and weary skepticism, because they had seen this before, the surge of attention, the promise of answers, the eventual return to silence. And no one wanted to believe again unless belief was unavoidable. For the family, the possibility of resolution reopened wounds that had never fully healed, because closure is not a single moment, it is a process, and the closer it seems, the more painful its absence becomes, and every update from investigators carried both relief and terror, the hope of truth paired with the fear of what that truth might contain. There were nights when detectives sat alone with the file, the glow of a desk lamp illuminating photographs taken before wrinkles and gray hair, images of a young woman frozen at 23, and the weight of responsibility pressed down in those moments, the understanding that this was not just an intellectual puzzle, but a promise made implicitly the night the patrol car arrived, that someone would one day be held accountable. And yet, despite the advances, despite the narrowed focus, the case hovered in a liminal state, no longer dormant, not yet resolved, a cold case warming but not breaking, its silence now charged with anticipation rather than neglect, and that shift was perhaps the most unsettling part of all. Because anticipation changes behavior, it makes people nervous, it triggers movements, decisions, confessions, mistakes, and somewhere, possibly, someone was feeling that pressure. someone who had lived for years believing the past was safely sealed. Now confronted with the possibility that science had reached across time and found them. The question was no longer whether the truth existed, but whether it would arrive cleanly or violently, quietly or with consequences that rippled outward, and as investigators prepared for the next step, knowing it could take months or unravel in an instant, the case stood on the edge of something irreversible. The road where her body was found still looked ordinary to passing drivers, just another stretch of asphalt under an open sky. But for those who knew the story, it had become a marker, a line between what was known and what remained hidden, and as the third decade since that night drew to a close, the silence that followed the crime felt different now, thinner, more fragile, as if the past itself were holding its breath, waiting to see whether this cold case would finally surrender its secrets, or retreat once more into the shadows it had inhabited for so long. The shift from theory to action came quietly, without sirens or press releases, marked instead by paperwork, warrants drafted in careful language, and meetings held behind closed doors where every word was weighed. Because when a cold case reaches this stage, the margin for error disappears, and a single misstep can send decades of work collapsing inward. Investigators began to move with a deliberate patience, revisiting names that now carried new significance, not because they were suddenly guilty, but because time and technology had rearranged their context, turning once innocent details into potential indicators, and the man at the center of the genetic branch became less of an abstraction and more of a presence. His life mapped out in timelines and spreadsheets, his past reconstructed through records he never imagined would matter. He had lived an unremarkable existence, at least on the surface, drifting through jobs, forming relationships that rarely lasted, never staying anywhere long enough to attract attention. A pattern that once looked like restlessness now appeared strategic, or at least convenient. And as detectives followed that thread backward, they found California in the early 90s waiting for them, a place and time that aligned too neatly to ignore. Surveillance began in the most understated way possible, casual observation, routines noted, habits logged, nothing intrusive, nothing that would tip him off because the goal at this stage was confirmation, not confrontation, and what they saw was ordinary, almost disappointingly so. A man who woke early, went to work, paid his bills, smiled at neighbors, the kind of normalcy that complicates suspicion rather than resolves it. But normal lives can hide extraordinary secrets, and that truth hovered over every observation, every report filed at the end of the day, because investigators knew that if their theory was correct, this man had carried something dark and unresolved for decades, a private history that no one around him could see. The legal threshold loomed large because without a direct DNA match, without an incontrovertible link between him and the crime scene, they were operating in a gray zone, one that demanded restraint, and so the focus shifted to what could be lawfully obtained, discarded items, public records, anything that might bridge the gap between suspicion and proof. Weeks stretched into months, the kind of waiting that tests resolve, and during that time the case took on a dual existence, intense and consuming for those directly involved, invisible to everyone else. The town continuing its routines unaware that a reckoning might be forming just beneath the surface. Then came the sample, unremarkable in appearance, collected from an object he had casually discarded. Something no one would miss, something that carried with it the possibility of finality. And when it was sent to the lab, the room felt heavier, the air charged with a quiet understanding that whatever came back would change the trajectory of the case forever. The wait for results was excruciating, not because investigators expected certainty, but because they understood the stakes. A match would not just identify a suspect, it would rewrite a narrative that had stood for decades, while a non-match would send them back into uncertainty, perhaps for good. When the report finally arrived, it did not deliver the clarity they wanted, but it did not absolve him either. The comparison showed significant overlap, stronger than the familial hit, weaker than a full confirmation, enough to escalate the case, not enough to close it. And that ambiguity became the new center of gravity, pulling every decision into its orbit. Prosecutors were brought in, their role shifting the conversation from investigation to accountability, and their questions were sharp, unforgiving, demanding answers that evidence could support, not theories or instincts, and as they reviewed the file, they acknowledged what detectives already knew, that this was closer than it had ever been, and still frustratingly incomplete. Meanwhile, the family was informed, cautiously, measured updates delivered with language designed to manage expectations. Because hope, once reignited, can be devastating if extinguished again, and they listened with a mixture of gratitude and restraint, having learned over the years that progress does not guarantee resolution. The media sensed movement, reporters filing requests asking about renewed efforts about DNA, about names they were not yet allowed to print, and the department responded with practiced silence because premature exposure could compromise everything, and the story, for once, needed to unfold without a spotlight. Inside the investigation, pressure mounted in subtle ways, not from outside forces, but from time itself, because witnesses were aging, opportunities narrowing, and every delay felt like a concession to chance, and yet haste was the enemy, because the wrong move could poison the well beyond repair. A decision was made to re-interview the man, not as a suspect, but as a person of interest, a distinction that mattered legally and psychologically, and when detectives sat across from him again, decades after their first brief encounter, the atmosphere was different, the questions more precise, the silences more intentional. He answered politely, sometimes too politely, his demeanor calm, controlled, offering explanations that fit just well enough to avoid contradiction, but not well enough to inspire confidence. And as the interview progressed, there were moments, fleeting and subtle, where his composure seemed to falter, not in obvious ways but in micro-expressions, a pause held a second too long, a detail corrected unnecessarily, things that would mean nothing in isolation and everything when layered atop years of context. Still, nothing he said crossed the line into provable falsehood, and when the interview ended, he walked out unrestrained, leaving behind a room full of professionals grappling with the same problem they had faced since 1994, how to turn suspicion into certainty without sacrificing integrity. As the case hovered in this precarious balance, the cold case unit found itself confronting an uncomfortable truth, that even with modern tools, even with persistence and skill, some cases resist resolution not because the truth is unknowable, but because it sits just beyond the reach of what can be legally demonstrated. The road where her body was found became a focal point again, investigators standing there with new eyes, considering whether something had been missed, whether the environment itself held clues overlooked by earlier searches, and while the landscape had changed, the sense of wrongness remained, an intangible reminder that this place had been chosen for a reason. Community rumors resurfaced, fueled by speculation and fragments of leaked information, names whispered again after years of dormancy, and with that came unease, the feeling that the past was stirring, that whatever had been buried might not stay that way much longer. In quiet moments, detectives acknowledged the emotional toll, the weight of carrying someone else's unfinished story, the frustration of proximity without closure, and yet they pressed on, because cold cases demand a particular kind of endurance, the willingness to exist in uncertainty without surrendering to it. As the investigation edged closer to a decisive moment, no one could say how it would end, whether the evidence would finally align or fracture under scrutiny. But one thing was clear: the silence that had enveloped the case for so long was no longer passive. It was tense, unstable, filled with the sense that something, whether justice or disappointment, was imminent. The story of that night in 1994 had not yet reached its conclusion, but it was no longer drifting. It was gathering momentum, pulled forward by science, memory, and an unrelenting refusal to let the unanswered remain unanswered. And as the case moved into its next phase, the line between the past and the present grew thinner still, as if time itself were preparing to give way under the pressure of truth. Momentum has a sound when it finally begins to move, not loud, not dramatic, but persistent, like a low vibration under the surface, and by now the case was humming with it, every action feeding the next, every decision narrowing the space in which doubt could hide. And yet the closer investigators drew to something solid, the more fragile everything felt, as if one wrong step could shatter years of restraint. The prosecutor's questions became more pointed, less theoretical, circling around the same unresolved core: how to place him at the scene without relying solely on probability, how to translate genetic overlap and behavioral inconsistencies into a narrative that could survive a courtroom. Because suspicion convinces minds, but evidence convinces juries. Attention returned to the night itself, not as a sequence of events, but as a pattern of opportunity: who had access, who had time, who had reason. And when that pattern was overlaid with the suspect's movements, something unsettling emerged, A window, narrow but real. A stretch of time he could not fully account for, framed by routine before and after like a blank space carefully bordered to avoid scrutiny. It wasn't enough on its own, but it was enough to justify a deeper dive. Financial records, employment logs, old phone bills retrieved from archives, each document a fragment of a life reconstructed backwards, and as the fragments accumulated, the portrait grew more coherent. Not incriminating in isolation, but suggestive in combination, a mosaic that pointed rather than proved. The cold case unit understood the danger of confirmation bias, the temptation to force pieces to fit, and so every assumption was challenged internally, every conclusion argued until it either collapsed or held. A discipline born from the knowledge that this case had already endured too much uncertainty to survive a mistake. Then came a detail that had been overlooked not because it was hidden, but because it seemed insignificant at the time, a vehicle sighting logged in a margin. A witness who mentioned a car idling near the road earlier that night, dismissed as vague, unhelpful, but when re-examined with fresh eyes, it aligned disturbingly well with the suspect's access to a similar model, common enough to blend in, rare enough to matter. The witness was found again, older now, memory softened by years, but the image persisted, a car with its lights off, an engine running, the kind of thing you notice only because it doesn't belong, and while memory is fragile, it can sometimes preserve the emotional truth of a moment long after the details fade. This reopened a path investigators had long assumed was closed, the possibility that the crime involved a brief interaction on the roadside, not a prolonged struggle, a moment of decision that escalated beyond control, and that theory reframed the absence of witnesses not as a mystery, but as a consequence of speed and surprise. Still, theory alone could not carry the case forward, and so the focus shifted once more to the physical evidence, to what might still be extracted from items collected decades earlier, advances in forensic analysis offering the chance to isolate traces previously lost in noise. And the lab became the center of gravity again, technicians working methodically, aware that the margin for contamination was unforgiving. When new results emerged, they did so quietly, but with weight, strengthening the connection between the original samples and the suspect's genetic profile. Not a perfect match, but closer, tighter, reducing the room for coincidence to an uncomfortable sliver, and prosecutors took notice, their skepticism tempered by the accumulation of converging lines. The legal strategy evolved accordingly, discussions turning to the possibility of a grand jury, a mechanism that could compel testimony, obtain records, apply pressure without committing prematurely to charges. And the mere consideration of that step signaled how far the case had come from its years of dormancy. Word reached the suspect indirectly, a shift in tone during routine interactions, a sense that questions were no longer exploratory, but directed, and that awareness manifested in subtle changes, routines altered, behaviors tightened. A man growing conscious of his own visibility after decades of blending into the background. Pressure has a way of amplifying cracks, and those around him began to notice small things, irritability, guarded conversations, a sudden reluctance to discuss the past, and while none of it amounted to evidence, it painted a picture of someone acutely aware that the ground beneath him was no longer stable. The family was informed again, this time with a different cadence, less caution, more gravity, and they listened in silence, absorbing the possibility that answers might finally be within reach, even as they braced themselves for the familiar ache of uncertainty, because hope, after so many years, feels dangerous. In the community, speculation resurfaced, fueled by leaks and rumors. The phrase cold case appearing again in local headlines, resurrecting memories some wished would stay buried. And with that came a renewed unease, the understanding that if justice was imminent, it would arrive with consequences that rippled outward, touching lives far removed from the original crime. Inside the department, the case dominated conversations not out of obsession but obligation, the sense that this was a threshold moment, that walking away now would be a betrayal of the promise made the night the body was found, and so they pressed forward, assembling a narrative that could withstand scrutiny from every angle. The suspect was called in again, this time with counsel present, the atmosphere markedly different, formality replacing familiarity, every question calculated, every answer measured, and though the interview yielded no confession, it yielded something else, a narrowing, the confirmation that his story, while consistent, left no room for the new evidence without bending. As days passed, the question shifted from whether to act to how, because the window for decisive movement was open, but not indefinitely, and delay carried its own risks, evidence aging further, witnesses becoming unreachable, the chance slipping away once more. The cold case, after years of waiting, was now demanding a response, and those tasked with delivering it felt the weight acutely, the knowledge that whatever came next would define the legacy of the investigation, either as a long-delayed triumph or as another near-miss etched into institutional memory. And somewhere within that tightening circle, the truth hovered, closer than it had ever been, no longer an abstract possibility, but a presence that shaped decisions, altered lives, and made sleep elusive for those who sensed that the silence of 1994 was finally beginning to break. Not with a sudden roar, but with the slow, inevitable sound of pressure reaching its limit. By the time the decision was made to move forward, it felt less like a choice and more like a surrender to momentum, the acknowledgement that the case had reached a point where standing still was no longer neutral, it was an act with consequences of its own. And so the machinery of the justice system began to turn in earnest, slow, deliberate, unforgiving. The grand jury was convened without announcement, a quiet room, ordinary citizens filing in with no sense of the history pressing in around them, unaware that they were about to inherit a story that stretched back decades, and prosecutors laid it out piece by piece, not as a sensational narrative, but as a chain of facts, each link modest on its own, formidable in accumulation. They spoke of a night in 1994, of a young woman whose path intersected briefly and fatally with someone else's, of evidence collected with care and then sealed away by the limitations of its time, of advances that allowed the past to speak again, and of a genetic trail that did not shout a name, but pointed insistently in one direction, narrowing the field until coincidence began to feel implausible. Witnesses testified, their voices steadier than their memories, describing impressions rather than certainties. A car where it shouldn't have been, a moment that felt wrong in retrospect, and the prosecutors were careful not to overreach, knowing that credibility here mattered more than drama, because the defense would be waiting for any sign of exaggeration. Experts followed, explaining DNA in terms meant to be understood, translating probability into language that could be weighed, not feared, and while no one claimed perfection, the message was clear, that the odds of this genetic overlap existing without meaningful connection were shrinking rapidly, and that science had carried the case further than human recollection ever could. The suspect's name was spoken in that room for the first time in an official capacity, and with it came the subtle shift that transforms a theory into an accusation, even if charges had not yet been filed, because once a name is introduced under oath, it cannot be fully withdrawn. Outside that room, life continued as usual, commuters driving past the courthouse unaware that history was being revisited inside, that decisions were being shaped which could finally redraw the narrative of a crime long assumed unsolvable. Inside the investigation team, nerves ran high not because they doubted the work, but because they understood how fragile progress could be at this stage, a single skeptical juror, a single procedural misstep, and the door could close again, perhaps forever. When the grand jury requested additional information, it was taken not as a setback, but as engagement, proof that the story was being examined rather than dismissed, and detectives worked late nights assembling supplemental materials, clarifying timelines, reinforcing the logic of the case without overstating its certainty. Meanwhile, the suspect sensed the shift even without direct confirmation. Subtle cues in the way law enforcement interacted, the sudden formality, the absence of casual conversation, and that awareness manifested in behavior that was difficult to quantify but impossible to ignore, a tension that followed him into everyday interactions. Those close to him noticed changes too, not dramatic, not explosive, but telling, a man who once spoke freely now choosing his words with care, a tendency to deflect when the past came up, as if it were a subject best left undisturbed, and while none of this proved anything, it suggested a consciousness of risk that had not existed before. The family of the victim lived in a parallel state of waiting, updates arriving in measured intervals, each one heavier than the last, because now the question was no longer whether the case might move, but whether it would move far enough to deliver something resembling justice. They revisited old photographs, spoke her name more often, not out of nostalgia, but preparation, because if charges were filed, her story would become public again, dissected, debated, and that prospect carried its own pain, the knowledge that closure often requires reopening wounds in full view of strangers. As the grand jury deliberated, days stretched into weeks, silence filling the gaps where answers were expected, and investigators were forced into a familiar posture, waiting without control, knowing that once the process left their hands, outcomes could no longer be managed through effort alone. When the decision finally came, it arrived without ceremony, a notification, a document, language precise and restrained, and yet its impact was immediate: authorization to proceed, to step out of the shadows of speculation and into the unforgiving light of formal charges. The arrest was planned with care, not out of fear of resistance, but out of respect for the gravity of the moment. Because this was not a man caught in the act. This was someone confronted by the accumulated weight of decades. And when officers approached him, their tone was calm, professional, aware that history was closing in around them. He did not run, did not resist, did not protest loudly. His reaction contained, almost resigned, and that restraint unsettled those who witnessed it more than any outburst might have, because it suggested an internal reckoning long in the making. News of the arrest broke quickly, headlines flashing the words the town had waited years to read: cold case, solved, arrest made, DNA evidence, and the reaction was immediate, shock rippling through a community that had grown accustomed to ambiguity, conversations reigniting overnight, memories resurfacing with startling clarity. For some, there was relief, the sense that a long-standing wrong had finally been addressed. For others, skepticism, the instinct to question whether justice delayed could truly be justice served, and that tension played out publicly as details emerged and opinions hardened. Inside the courtroom, the case took on a different texture, governed by rules and procedures that stripped away narrative and demanded proof, and prosecutors laid out their argument carefully, aware that the defense would challenge every inference, every statistical claim, every assumption about behavior and motive. The defense responded as expected, emphasizing the absence of eyewitnesses, the decades-long gap, the dangers of relying on evolving science, casting doubt wherever possible, and reminding the jury that suspicion, no matter how compelling, is not certainty. As testimony unfolded, the weight of time was impossible to ignore, witnesses struggling with memory, experts contextualizing limitations, and through it all, the victim's presence felt both central and strangely distant, represented by photographs and reports rather than a living voice. For the family, each day in court was an endurance test, listening as her life was reduced to evidence, her death debated in technical terms, and yet they remained because absence had already taken enough, and this was the price of pursuing the truth to its end. Outside, the town watched closely, the case becoming a mirror in which fears and hopes were reflected, questions raised about how many other answers might be hiding in evidence rooms, waiting for science to catch up. As the trial progressed, it became clear that the outcome was no longer solely about one night in 1994, but about the broader promise implicit in every cold case, that time does not erase accountability, that silence is not the same as innocence, and that patience, combined with persistence, can bend even decades toward resolution. Whether the verdict would satisfy that promise remained uncertain, because courtrooms are not places of catharsis, they are places of judgment, and judgment does not always align neatly with truth as it is felt. But as the proceedings moved forward, one thing was undeniable. The case that once lingered in shadows had been forced into the open, its silence broken at last, and whatever the outcome, the long wait for an answer was finally ending, replaced by something far more difficult and far more human. The reckoning with what justice can and cannot restore after 30 years of unanswered loss. The trial settled into a rhythm that was both relentless and exhausting, days marked by testimony and cross-examination, nights filled with analysis and second-guessing, because once a cold case enters a courtroom, it stops belonging to investigators and becomes a public test of memory, science, and belief, each side trying to shape fragments of the past into a version of truth that 12 strangers could agree upon. Jurors listened as experts returned to the stand, walking them through charts and probabilities, explaining how DNA that once whispered could now speak with authority, but never with absolute certainty, and that distinction became the battleground, the thin line where confidence ended and doubt was invited in. The defense pressed hard on that boundary, questioning every assumption, reminding the jury that decades had passed, that evidence had aged, that procedures had evolved, and that what seemed compelling now might have looked very different in 1994. Planting seeds of uncertainty with surgical precision. Prosecutors responded by reframing the narrative, not as a single piece of evidence demanding belief, but as a convergence, independent lines crossing at one point in time, the genetic trail, the geographic proximity, the unaccounted window, the witness memory, each imperfect alone, but together forming a pattern that resisted innocent explanation. As the days wore on, the emotional weight became impossible to ignore. Photographs from the victim's life displayed on screens. A face frozen in youth looking out at a room full of people who had aged decades since her death, and that contrast pressed silently on everyone present. A reminder that time had taken far more from her than it had from anyone else. The suspect sat quietly throughout, expression controlled, occasionally conferring with counsel. His demeanor studied by observers for meaning, though meaning is notoriously unreliable when read from posture and expression alone. And still, the stillness itself became a kind of statement. A man holding his ground against the slow tide of accusation. Outside the courtroom, commentary grew louder, opinions forming along familiar lines, those who trusted science versus those wary of its reach, those who believed justice delayed was still justice, and those who feared that delay compromised fairness. And the town found itself divided not by loyalty, but by interpretation. The family endured each day with measured composure, their grief visible but contained, having learned long ago that emotion alone carries no weight in legal spaces, and yet their presence served as a constant anchor, a human counterpoint to the abstractions of evidence and probability. When closing arguments arrived, they did so without spectacle, both sides aware that theatrics would not sway a jury that had been immersed in detail for weeks, and the prosecution spoke of responsibility, of accountability that survives time, of a promise implicit in the collection of evidence, that it would one day be used to speak for the dead. The defense countered with caution, urging jurors to resist the pull of narrative, to remember that unanswered questions remain unanswered for a reason, and that doubt, once introduced, cannot be ignored simply because it is inconvenient or emotionally unsatisfying. The jury retired to deliberate, carrying with them not just the facts of the case, but the weight of decades, the knowledge that their decision would not just resolve a trial, but redefine a story that had lived unresolved for most of their adult lives. Hours passed, then days, the silence stretching, speculation filling the void, and investigators waited again, in a posture all too familiar, knowing that once more, the outcome lay beyond their control. When the verdict finally came, it did not arrive as a single, clean moment of release, but as a measured reading, each word heavy, each pause deliberate, and as it was spoken, the room seemed to exhale and tense at the same time, relief and uncertainty colliding in a way that left no one untouched. The reaction was immediate and fractured, some finding validation, others disappointment, because verdicts rarely deliver unanimity of feeling, especially in cases burdened by time, and the sense of closure, if it existed at all, was complicated, partial, shaped by individual expectations rather than collective relief. For the family, the moment was layered with emotion, vindication intertwined with grief, the acknowledgement of what had been lost arriving too late to change anything that truly mattered, and yet carrying significance nonetheless, because recognition is not restoration, but it is not nothing either. For the investigators, the verdict marked an end point and a beginning, the conclusion of one pursuit and the onset of reflection, the inevitable question of what could have been done differently, sooner, better, and how many other cases waited in similar silence. The suspect was led away, his future now defined by a decision rendered by people who had known him only through evidence and argument, and whether justice had been fully served or merely approximated became a matter of perspective, debated in headlines and private conversations alike. The town absorbed the outcome slowly, the initial shock giving way to quieter contemplation, because answers, once delivered, do not erase the years spent without them, and the memory of that night in 1994 did not disappear, it simply changed shape, from an open wound into a scar that still ached under pressure. In the weeks that followed, attention faded, cameras moved on, and the case slipped from daily conversation back into memory, but it did not vanish, because its resolution, imperfect and contested, had altered the town's relationship with its past, proving that silence can be broken, but not undone. And in that lingering quiet, with the trial concluded and the headlines archived, the true complexity of the cold case emerged. That justice is not a single event, but a process stretched across time, shaped by human limits, scientific progress, and the enduring need to believe that even after decades, the truth can still surface, carrying with it consequences that echo far beyond the moment they are finally acknowledged. After the verdict, the case entered a quieter phase, one that rarely makes headlines but carries its own gravity, where the legal outcome settles into everyday reality and the people touched by the crime begin the slow, uneven process of recalibration, adjusting to a world where a question that once defined their lives has been replaced by an answer that does not quite fit the space it leaves behind. Appeals were filed as expected, pages of argument challenging procedure, interpretation, the reliability of science applied retroactively, and with each filing, the case proved again that resolution in court does not mean finality in spirit, that the past, once stirred, resists being neatly put back into place. The defense framed the conviction as a cautionary tale, warning of the dangers of trusting evolving technology too deeply, of letting probability masquerade as certainty, while prosecutors stood by the work, emphasizing safeguards, standards, and the careful restraint exercised at every stage. And the truth, as always, existed somewhere between those poles, filtered through perspective and belief. For the family, the appeals process reopened familiar anxieties, the fear that everything achieved could be undone, that the fragile sense of acknowledgement they had gained might dissolve under legal scrutiny, and they learned again how to live with conditional outcomes, how to hold on to meaning without guarantees. Investigators, now distanced from daily proceedings, reflected on the long arc of the case, on the nights spent revisiting files, on the technology that transformed whispers into testimony, and on the uncomfortable recognition that progress often arrives too late to feel triumphant, arriving instead as a muted confirmation of what had long been suspected. The evidence, once boxed and forgotten, now occupied a different place, preserved not as potential, but as precedent, a demonstration of what persistence and patience can achieve, and also of the limitations that remain, because even with breakthroughs, certainty is rarely absolute. In the community, conversations shifted from speculation to interpretation, debates over fairness, over closure, over whether justice delayed can truly satisfy the need for resolution, and those debates revealed something deeper, a collective grappling with the idea that answers do not heal in the way people imagine they will. The road where the body was found remained unchanged, its significance invisible to passing drivers, but for those who knew the story, it had become a symbol of transition, no longer just the site of an unresolved tragedy, but the starting point of a reckoning that stretched across generations. New cold cases began to surface in the news, fueled by advances in forensic genealogy, and each one carried echoes of this story, hope tempered by caution. The promise of answers weighed against the cost of revisiting old wounds, and the case from 1994 was often cited, not as a blueprint, but as a reminder of complexity. Law enforcement agencies took note, reviewing evidence storage practices, reevaluating old files, investing in technology with an eye toward the future, and while no one said it aloud, there was an understanding that this case had altered expectations, raised the bar for what persistence could demand. The suspect, now convicted, existed largely outside public view, his life reduced to legal filings and institutional routines, and yet his presence lingered in discourse, a focal point for arguments about guilt, innocence, and the reach of modern science into long-settled lives. For the family, the passage of time took on a different quality, no longer defined by waiting for movement, but by learning how to live with a version of closure that felt incomplete, a truth acknowledged too late to offer comfort, but too significant to dismiss. Anniversaries came and went, marked quietly, without cameras, without statements, and in those moments, the memory of the young woman at the center of it all resurfaced not as a victim, but as a person, her laughter recalled, her plans imagined, her absence felt in ways no verdict could address. The cold case label, once a mark of failure, had transformed into something else entirely, a testament to endurance, to the idea that time does not erase responsibility, even as it complicates it, and that belief, fragile but persistent, became part of the case's legacy. Yet beneath that legacy lay unresolved questions, not about who, but about why, about the precise sequence of decisions that led to that night, questions the trial could not answer and never would, leaving a residue of mystery that resisted closure. In conversations late at night, among detectives, among journalists, among those who had followed the case for years, there was an acknowledgement that even solved cases leave shadows, spaces where certainty cannot reach, and that those spaces are not failures but reflections of human limits. The story of 1994 continued to be told, reshaped by perspective, by distance, by new generations encountering it for the first time, and each retelling carried the same undercurrent, that the past is never truly past, that it waits, patient and persistent, for moments when the present is finally capable of confronting it. And so the case settled into history, not as a clean conclusion, but as a layered narrative, part warning, part reassurance, carrying forward the unsettling truth that answers, when they come after decades of silence, arrive not as absolution, but as echoes, reverberating long after the final word is spoken, reminding everyone who listens that even when a cold case is declared solved, its impact remains unfinished, lingering in the quiet spaces where memory and justice intersect. Time has a way of softening edges without erasing weight, and as the months after the trial stretched into years, the case settled into that uneasy space where resolution exists on paper but meaning remains unsettled, where the legal system has spoken but the human questions continue to murmur beneath the surface, persistent and unresolved. The appeals process moved slowly, as it always does, arguments refined, language sharpened, each filing a reminder that even verdicts are provisional until every avenue has been exhausted. And for those who had lived with the case for decades, this prolonged uncertainty felt strangely familiar, a return to waiting, albeit under different terms. Legal analysts weighed in, dissecting the use of forensic genealogy, debating thresholds, precedents, and safeguards, and in doing so, they transformed a single tragedy into a broader conversation about the future of criminal justice, about how far science should be allowed to reach back into lives shaped long before its capabilities existed. Some saw progress, a system finally equipped to confront its past. Others saw risk, the possibility that probability could overshadow presumption of innocence, and that tension became part of the case's afterlife, discussed in classrooms, conferences, and courtrooms far removed from the road where it all began. For investigators, the shift from active pursuit to post-conviction analysis was disorienting, a sudden absence of urgency after years defined by it, and in that quiet, reflection took hold, the recognition that the job does not end with an arrest or a verdict, that responsibility extends into how a case is remembered and what it teaches those who inherit its lessons. They revisited the early missteps, not with blame but with honesty, acknowledging the limitations of the era, the pressures of volume, the absence of tools now considered essential, and that introspection became a kind of informal audit, a way of ensuring that the silence of 1994 would not be repeated in future cases. The family continued forward, not healed, but changed, their grief no longer suspended by waiting, now anchored to a fixed outcome, and that anchoring, paradoxically, brought its own challenges, because hope had once provided motion, and now they had to navigate stillness, the long aftermath of acknowledgement without restoration. They spoke publicly only when necessary, choosing privacy over commentary, aware that every statement would be interpreted through lenses they could not control, and in that restraint, they reclaimed a measure of agency that the years of speculation had eroded. The community's relationship with the case evolved as well, the initial shock giving way to a quieter reckoning, conversations less about guilt or innocence and more about vulnerability, about how easily ordinary lives can intersect with violence, and how long the consequences of those intersections can last. Schools used the case as a cautionary example, not sensationally but reflectively discussing safety, trust, and the importance of community awareness, and in that way the story took on an educational role, shaping behavior in subtle, unrecorded ways. Journalists who had covered the trial revisited their own work, examining tone, balance, the ethics of reporting on grief and accusation, and some acknowledged privately that the most difficult stories are not those without answers, but those with answers that satisfy only partially. The Cold Case Unit, now armed with new funding and renewed mandate, turned its attention to other files, other names, other nights left unresolved, and yet the shadow of 1994 followed them, a reminder that persistence can pay off, but also that patience exacts a toll measured in years, in lives altered long before justice arrives. Within law enforcement, policies shifted incrementally, evidence retention standardized, cross-agency databases expanded, training updated to reflect lessons learned, and while no one policy could undo the past, these changes represented a collective attempt to honor it by preventing repetition. The suspects' appeals continued to wind their way through the system, each denial reinforcing the verdict, each delay prolonging the public's engagement, and with every development, the case briefly resurfaced in headlines, a familiar name paired with legal terminology that underscored how unfinished finality can feel. For some in the town, doubt never fully dissipated, skepticism lingering as a quiet undercurrent, and that skepticism was not necessarily defiance, but a manifestation of how deeply the case had embedded itself into local consciousness, too complex to be reduced to a single narrative. Others embraced the outcome as affirmation, proof that patience and science could bridge even decades-long gaps, and that belief became a source of comfort, a way to reconcile the years of fear and uncertainty with a sense of eventual accountability. Anniversaries of the crime passed with less public attention now, marked instead by personal rituals, a visit to a gravesite, a moment of silence, a memory shared among those who still felt its pull, and in those moments, the story narrowed again, shedding its legal and cultural layers to return to its origin, the loss of one life irreplaceable and singular. The road remained unchanged, indifferent to its history, cars passing without pause, and yet for those who knew, it served as a quiet reminder that places can carry weight even when they appear ordinary, that landscapes absorb stories whether or not anyone is there to listen. As the years continued to unfold, the case from 1994 became less a headline and more a reference point, cited in discussions about cold cases, forensic innovation, and the ethics of reopening the past, and through that continued relevance, it maintained a presence that refused to fade entirely. Because some stories, once told, never truly end. They adapt, refract, and persist, carried forward by the questions they raise rather than the answers they provide. And in that sense, the California cold case of 1994 remained alive, not as an open wound, but as a lasting imprint on the people, the place, and the system that had been shaped by its long, silent journey toward reckoning. Night returned to the town the way it always had, quietly, without ceremony, streetlights flickering on one by one, casting cones of yellow over sidewalks that looked no different than they had decades earlier. And yet for those who remembered, darkness still carried an echo, a reflexive tightening in the chest, a sense that nightfall was never just nightfall anymore, not after everything that had been absorbed into it. In living rooms and kitchens, conversations about the case grew less frequent but no less intense when they surfaced, often triggered by something mundane, a news segment about another cold case, a headline about DNA technology advancing yet again, and suddenly the past felt close, not as a story but as a presence, seated at the table, listening. The files themselves were no longer dormant, no longer stacked in quiet anonymity. They had been digitized, cataloged, referenced, transformed from physical weight into data points, and in that transformation something intangible shifted. The case no longer tied solely to a filing cabinet in California but accessible, replicable, immortal in servers humming far from the scene where it began. Detectives who had retired years earlier watched from a distance, some with pride, some with lingering frustration, each carrying their own private version of the truth, shaped by what they had seen, what they had missed, what they had suspected but could never prove. And retirement did not erase those memories. It simply gave them more space to speak. One former investigator admitted, quietly, that he still replayed the first walkthrough of the scene in his mind. The way the air felt, the way silence pressed in, the sense that something was wrong long before the evidence confirmed it, and that intuition, dismissed at the time as instinct, now felt like a warning he wished he had trusted more deeply. Others defended the early work with equal conviction, pointing out that hindsight is a luxury afforded only by time, and that in 1994, they had done what they could with what they had, a truth that exists alongside regret without canceling it out, creating a complicated legacy rather than a simple failure. The science continued to evolve, methods refined, databases expanded, algorithms improved, and with each advancement came renewed scrutiny of past convictions. Not just this one, but countless others, and the case became part of a larger wave, a catalyst in discussions about reliability, ethics, and the power of genetic information to reach across generations. Families unrelated to the crime felt its ripple effects too. distant relatives of the convicted grappling with the realization that their own DNA had played a role in unraveling a secret they never knew existed. Forced into an uncomfortable proximity with violence that had nothing to do with their lives until it suddenly did. That realization sparked debate far beyond the courtroom. In editorials, podcasts, panel discussions, people asking whether consent can be retroactive, whether justice justifies intrusion, whether the past has a right to remain buried when technology insists on uncovering it, and the answers varied depending on who was speaking and what they stood to lose. Meanwhile, the victim's name, once a fixture in headlines, now appeared less often, mentioned briefly, sometimes almost as an afterthought, and those who loved them noticed the subtle shift from focus on a life lost to focus on systems, processes, and precedents, a necessary evolution perhaps, but one that felt like a second kind of disappearance. They worked to keep that name alive in quieter ways, scholarships, memorials, acts of service carried out without press releases, gestures meant not to prove a point but to preserve a memory, to assert that before the case, before the cold designation, there was a person who mattered simply because they existed. The town itself continued to change, new families moving in, unaware of the history beneath their feet, children riding bikes along streets once cordoned off with tape, laughter replacing the hushed fear that had once defined the area, and this generational turnover softened the edges of the story, even as it refused to let it vanish completely. Every so often, someone would stumble upon an old article online, share it on social media, and the cycle would briefly reignite, comments filling with shock, disbelief, arguments from people who had no emotional stake beyond curiosity, and those who had lived through it learned to scroll past, protecting themselves from reopening wounds that never fully closed. For law enforcement agencies across the country, the case became a reference, cited in training materials, used to illustrate both perseverance and caution. A reminder that time is not neutral, that delays alter lives on both sides of the justice system, and that closure delayed can feel indistinguishable from closure denied. There was also the lingering awareness that not every cold case would have this outcome, that for every file reopened and resolved, dozens more would remain unanswered, victims without advocates, families without conclusions, and that imbalance weighed heavily on those who understood the scale of what remained hidden. The success of one case did not erase the silence of others, and investigators felt that tension acutely, the knowledge that celebration must be tempered by humility, that solving one mystery does not grant absolution for those still unresolved. Late at night, in the quiet hours when distractions fell away, the story returned to its simplest form, a moment in 1994 when a choice was made, a life was altered, and a chain of consequences was set in motion that would stretch across decades, touching people who could never have imagined their connection to it. That moment, frozen in time, resisted reinterpretation, no matter how many legal briefs were filed, no matter how many analyses were written, it remained what it was, an irreversible act whose reverberations could be traced but never undone. And so the case lingered, not as an active investigation, not as a breaking news alert, but as a low, constant hum beneath the surface of collective memory. A reminder that even when answers arrive, they do not always arrive cleanly, and they do not always bring peace. Because resolution is not the same as relief, and understanding is not the same as acceptance. And in the space between those distinctions, the California case of 1994 continued to exist, not solved in the way stories promise, but settled into a quieter, more complex truth, one that acknowledged accountability while leaving room for doubt, grief, and the enduring weight of what can never be restored. The final chapter does not announce itself with certainty. It arrives softly, almost reluctantly, as if aware that no ending can truly contain what has unfolded. And in that softness there is a different kind of gravity, a weight that presses inward rather than outward, drawing everything back to the beginning even as time keeps moving forward. Because despite verdicts and documents and official language that insists on completion, there remains a residue that refuses to be categorized, an emotional sediment left behind by decades of waiting, wondering, and living alongside a question mark that never fully disappeared. In quiet moments, when the noise of debate fades, the case reveals its truest shape, not as a solved puzzle, not as a triumph of technology, but as a long corridor lined with doors that were never opened in time, choices that cannot be revisited, Seconds that stretched into years simply because no one yet knew how to listen to what the evidence was trying to say. The phrase cold case still carries a chill, even now, even after the files have been closed, because cold does not only describe temperature, it describes distance, the space between an event and the world's ability to respond to it. The years when truth existed but lacked a voice loud enough to be heard. For the family, that coldness never fully thaws. It shifts instead, becoming something quieter, a constant presence rather than a sharp pain. Grief no longer defined by shock but by permanence, by the knowledge that time can dull edges but cannot restore what was taken. They live with a name etched into memory rather than headlines now, a face recalled in private rather than broadcast publicly, and that transition feels necessary, even protective, a way of reclaiming something that had been consumed by speculation and scrutiny for far too long. In the community, the story settles into local folklore, spoken of with lowered voices, referenced in passing, a shared memory that binds generations who never experienced the fear firsthand but inherited its echo, a reminder that safety can be fragile and that normalcy can fracture without warning. The road where it happened remains deceptively ordinary, asphalt stretched beneath indifferent skies, no marker large enough to capture the significance of what occurred there, and yet those who know still slow as they pass, an involuntary gesture of recognition, of respect, of lingering unease. For investigators, both active and retired, the case becomes a measuring stick, a reference point against which other investigations are compared. Not because it was perfect, but because it was imperfect in ways that taught hard lessons about patience, about humility, about the danger of assuming that silence means absence. They speak of it less often now, but when they do, there is a change in tone, less defensiveness, more reflection, an understanding that the pursuit of justice is rarely linear, that progress often arrives disguised as delay, and that certainty is a luxury rarely afforded in real time. The science that ultimately shifted the balance continues to advance, and with it, expectations rise, the public growing accustomed to answers delivered decades late but framed as inevitabilities. And that expectation carries its own risk, the illusion that technology alone can correct human error, forgetting that tools are only as effective as the questions we ask with them. Ethicists continue to argue, legal scholars continue to analyze, commentators continue to debate, and in those discussions, the case lives on as an example, a precedent, a warning, and sometimes a reassurance, depending on who is speaking and why. But beneath all of that, beneath the commentary and analysis, there remains the unalterable core of the story, a moment when violence intersected with ordinary life, when someone left home and did not return, when the world tilted and never fully corrected itself. That moment cannot be improved by explanation, it cannot be softened by context, it exists outside of justification, and its impact radiates forward no matter how many years pass, touching people who had nothing to do with the act itself but everything to do with its aftermath. The label solved sits uneasily beside that reality, useful for records, insufficient for closure, because resolution in legal terms does not erase the psychological imprint left on those who waited for it, and it does not answer the quieter questions that surface in the absence of urgency. Questions about whether things might have been different if the tools had existed sooner, about how many other stories remain suspended in similar limbo, about how society decides which cases receive renewed attention and which fade into obscurity without ceremony. Those questions linger long after the last appeal is denied, long after the final article is archived, long after public interest drifts elsewhere, because they are not specific to one case, they belong to a system that is constantly negotiating its relationship with time, memory, and accountability. And so the story ends the way it began, not with certainty, but with awareness and understanding that some truths arrive too late to feel like victory, that some answers deepen the mystery rather than resolve it, and that justice, even when achieved, carries a shadow. The California case of 1994 becomes something larger than itself, not because it was unique, but because it was familiar, a reflection of how easily a life can vanish into statistics, how slowly systems can respond, and how relentless the passage of time can be when measured against human loss. It stands as a reminder that cold cases are not dormant. They are waiting for the moment when attention returns, when technology catches up, when someone decides that the silence has lasted long enough. And even then, when that moment finally comes, when files are reopened and names resurface, when the narrative shifts from unknown to known, there is no clean ending waiting on the other side, only a quieter reckoning, a space where answers exist alongside unanswered questions. Because the true legacy of a case like this is not found in a verdict or a sentence. It is found in the way it alters how we remember, how we investigate, how we listen to what the past is still trying to tell us. It is found in the acknowledgement that time does not heal all wounds. It merely teaches us how to live with them, how to carry them forward without letting them define everything that follows. And as the years continue to move on, as new cases emerge and new headlines demand attention, the echo of 1994 remains, faint but persistent, a reminder that some stories never fully conclude. They simply fade into the background, waiting for someone to pause, to listen, and to remember that behind every cold case, solved or not, there is a human story that never stops unfolding. Dawn arrives without apology, pale light creeping across windows and streets that have carried too much history to notice the difference between yesterday and decades ago. And in that quiet return of morning, there is something unsettling. A reminder that the world keeps moving even when a story has taken everything it can from the people bound to it. The case no longer belongs to the present tense, yet it refuses to stay entirely in the past, hovering instead in a suspended state, cited, remembered, argued over, a permanent fixture in the mental geography of those who encountered it, directly or indirectly, willingly or by chance. There are still moments when a detail resurfaces unexpectedly, a photograph rediscovered, a quote reread, a line from an old report that suddenly feels heavier than it did before, and in those moments the distance collapses, the years fold inward, and 1994 feels close enough to touch. That closeness is deceptive because understanding does not equal proximity, and even with all that has been revealed, the emotional core of the case remains just out of reach, a space where logic gives way to something more elusive, something that cannot be diagrammed or archived. People often ask what closure looks like, but the question itself assumes a shape that does not exist, as if grief can be sealed, as if answers can substitute for time, as if a conclusion can rewrite what was lived in uncertainty for so long. Those who lived through it know better. They know that closure is not a door that shuts. It is a landscape you learn to navigate, uneven and unpredictable, where some days feel lighter and others feel as heavy as the first night the news broke. In that landscape, the case becomes less about what happened and more about what followed, the years shaped by absence, the habits formed around loss, the ways people learned to speak carefully, to trust selectively, to measure safety not by statistics but by memory. The community carries those lessons quietly now, embedded in behavior rather than headlines, in the way doors are locked a little earlier, in the way parents linger a little longer before saying goodnight, in the unspoken awareness that certainty is fragile. For the investigators who once chased leads through dimly lit offices and sleepless nights, the case has become a marker of time, a reminder of who they were when it began and who they became by the time it ended, their careers divided by a single file that refused to stay buried. Some still dream about it, fragments replaying without warning, the sound of radios, the weight of unanswered questions, the feeling of standing at a scene knowing instinctively that whatever happened there would not be easily undone. And those dreams do not fade simply because the paperwork is complete. The technology that finally tipped the balance continues to advance, promising clarity where there was once only doubt. But with that promise comes a quiet unease, the awareness that every answer delivered too late carries its own kind of loss, the loss of time that cannot be returned to the people who waited. There are other names now, other cases moving through the same slow cycle, introduced with urgency, then gradually absorbed into silence, and the story of 1994 serves as both a beacon and a warning, proof that persistence can work, but also evidence of how long justice can hesitate. Families watching from the sidelines see themselves reflected in that delay, measuring their own hope against decades rather than months, wondering what it will cost to keep believing, and whether belief itself becomes a burden when answers remain out of reach. The media has mostly moved on, drawn to newer mysteries, fresher tragedies, stories that have not yet exhausted public attention, and in that movement there is a sense of inevitability, the understanding that attention is finite, that not every story can remain illuminated forever. Yet even in obscurity, the case persists, carried by those who refuse to let it dissolve into abstraction, who remember that behind every forensic breakthrough and legal argument was a human life interrupted, a future erased in an instant that cannot be revisited or revised. That interruption defines everything that follows, no matter how many years pass, no matter how many explanations are offered. It remains the central truth around which all other details orbit, immutable and unresolved in ways that no verdict can fully address. Sometimes, in quiet reflection, the case feels less like a story and more like a question, not about guilt or innocence, but about time itself, about how societies remember, about what is owed to the past when the present finally catches up. It raises questions about patience, about accountability, about whether waiting for answers is an act of hope or an act of endurance, and whether the difference matters when the waiting spans a lifetime. The phrase cold case is still used, still spoken with the same clinical distance, but those who know understand that there is nothing cold about it, that the label masks years of heat, of anger, fear, grief, and longing compressed into two words that sound deceptively simple. Even solved, the case retains that heat, radiating quietly, influencing how people think about justice, about trust, about the limits of certainty, and that influence extends far beyond the borders of California, far beyond the year stamped on the file. It exists now as part of a collective memory, not constantly revisited, but never fully forgotten, a reference point that surfaces when discussions turn to persistence, to the cost of delay, to the uneasy balance between technology and humanity. And in that memory, the story does not conclude with triumph or relief. It concludes with acknowledgement, the recognition that some wounds do not close neatly, that some answers arrive carrying as much weight as the questions they resolve. The night of 1994 cannot be undone, no matter how much light is cast upon it decades later, and that truth settles slowly, unevenly, into the consciousness of those who lived with the case, a truth that resists narrative satisfaction. What remains is a quiet understanding, shared by those who followed the case closely, that resolution is not the end of impact, that justice, even when achieved, leaves behind a long shadow shaped by time and loss. The road is still there, the town still breathing, the people still living their lives, but the story has carved its place into all of it, an invisible layer beneath the ordinary, felt rather than seen. And so the case fades, not into nothingness, but into the background of lived experience, a constant reminder that some stories never truly finish. They simply stop being told out loud. They linger instead in memory, in behavior, in the quiet moments when someone pauses and thinks about how long it took, about what was lost along the way, about how the past has a way of waiting patiently for the present to catch up. Because in the end, the most unsettling truth of the California case is not that it took 30 years to resolve, but that even after all that time, even after all that effort, the silence it left behind still speaks, low and persistent, asking nothing, promising nothing, simply reminding us that some mysteries, once lived, never fully let go.